Howdy, folks. Part four of A Beginner's Guide to Public Speaking with me, Jack McCurdy, and Peter Chittum. Part four is preparing your presentation. So this is the meaty bit that I've just called it off to the side here. I've called it the meaty bit with Peter, but this is where the bulk of the work actually takes place when it comes to public speaking and delivering a presentation. Preparation is key.
Provided you don't put it off to the very end, like some people have a chronic problem of doing. But yeah,
I've been in both camps. I will hold my hands up and admit I have been in the scramble presentation mode, to the point where I have been at conferences and having to tweak things 10 minutes before my session.
Yeah.
And I've also been the most prepared I could have possibly be, which is the camp I sit in now, because I have a much better time when I'm fully and properly prepared for a talk. But yeah, preparation is king and will build a lot of confidence going into your when it comes to delivering the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of a running joke in especially developer relations circles about, that preparation that you started like an hour before you were supposed to give it. Like I don't recommend that. And especially, for the beginner guide, it's the surefire way of failing.
Yeah. You set yourself up for failure. Fail to prepare to fail.
There you go. That's a good one.
Throughout this series, we've just used so many of these analogies and what you call them, idioms or
aphorisms, is it? I don't know. Yeah,
but they all ring so true. But yeah, preparation really is the foundation for allowing the magic to happen before you step on stage or that webinar goes live. And to be able to do that, you need to start with a great content and solid structure. So one of the first things that for me that I do when I'm writing a presentation and my talk's been accepted, we've talked about submitting it. You've got the joyous email, congratulations, your talk's been accepted, or would like you to present this talk at this event that we are hosting. You have to start with a structure of your talk. And for me, that structure begins with a strong hook to get people bought into the presentation straight away at the beginning, and breaking down the 3, maybe 5 key ideas or takeaways throughout the middle of your presentation, and a close with a clear summary or a call to action. So when you think about writing this thing, you've got your abstract, start with the hook. Why should people invest in this thing? Maybe a story or a personal anecdote, which will engage the audience and get them on their edge of their seat and rapturous attention to what it is you're about to present about. The 3 key takeaways sequentially in the subject area that you're talking about, and then that clear summary or the call to action, what people need to do with it afterwards. And that's where I always start when I am crafting a great talk.
Yeah, I'm a lot more loose with structure, and I have used that more like classic, I'll call it, structure in presentations. At the same time, I think it depends on what the topic is. It's certainly for a beginner, starting with a well-known and well-established structure is a really it's going to set yourself up for at least it being less complicated to deliver. So there's a book that I'm really fond of. See if I can hold it up for the camera. Where is it? There it is. Presentation patterns. So this is a whole book, and the idea of patterns kind of comes from software architecture and software development, and it's a bunch of software developers who also give talks who kind of collected their ideas. Whatever your structure is, have a structure. Like, that's the most important thing. But there can be some really fun and different ways, and there can be like certain hooks to use or to not use. Again, kind of depending on how the story of your presentation is going to unfold. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention story there, because many of the presentations, the great presentations that I have seen or even delivered myself, have had a story
Hmm.
and have had a narrative weaved into it.
Yeah.
Many of the things that you might be talking about. So, for example, you're giving a talk on flows or best practices with flows, highlighting your personal story and
Hmm.
taking somebody on a journey through thoughts, emotions, feelings as you were solving a challenge yourself
Yeah.
is going to be imperative to that message sinking in. I find um, adjacent adjacent to that, if you are trying to introduce people to a topic that they are unfamiliar with, but technical or otherwise, another really powerful tool is how do you translate what you're talking about to something that is widely and generally understandable.
Hmm.
So I think about previously in this video series, I mentioned a talk that I'm giving Mid-Atlantic Dreaming and Texas Dreaming, which is DevOps is more than just deployments. And one of the analogies that I'm going to probably end up using for that talk is how DevOps is synonymous with owning, maintaining, and operating a car.
Mm.
And the more that you can use really tangible and clear examples and tie what the specificity of what you're talking about back to something that is generally well understood can
Yeah.
really help frame your talk in a way that it is going to have a lot of impact and value. People can associate what you've talked about with something that they know, and therefore it will make it stick. They'll come. Hopefully, my idea and my thinking is they'll come away from that and go, "Jack was the car guy. He talked about
Hmm.
DevOps as cars, and that makes sense to me."
Yeah, that's interesting because so I was just at a conference last week. It's a developer conference, and uh, the talk that I'm thinking of was called "Open Source is a Sewer," which
I'm intrigued.
sounds like it's really denigrating open source, but quite the opposite. This is somebody who he works for an agency in Germany, a government agency in Germany, that's called the Sovereign Technology Fund, and um, basically it's an agency that's tasked with supporting and thinking about open source software and libraries, basically the foundational building blocks of what every piece of software is built on these days as critical infrastructure. And it's such a it's and of course, what was the infrastructure he used to as an analogy, it was the London sewers and Bazalgette's sewer that he built after the London fire, or the Great Stink, I think it was, that actually kicked that off. So it was such a powerful like hook to bring somebody in. And not only that, but he works in Germany and was coming to London, so picking a very local piece of infrastructure was such a clever and great way to to extend that even further from the analogy of critical infrastructure to making it a very personal story of critical infrastructure to many of the people who are going to be attending.
Yeah, I'm I'm still to give you some perspective. Like, I'm stuck on the sewer thing. I want to I want to go back and listen to this talk. Was this one recorded? I'm curious. And
Yeah, they always do. Yeah, I'll share it with you when I'll probably post it on social media because it was one of my favorite talks of the conference that I was at. So it's a conference called Monkey Graw that's run by the Red Monk folks.
nice, nice.
Uh,
Peter, you mentioned when we were talking about ideating in the previous video, storytelling and the storytelling framework. So tell me a little bit about that and how that's helpful.
Yeah, so storytelling frameworks, as I said in the previous video, there's probably dozens of these, but all they are is, think of it as scaffolding in order to share ideas. And if you use a storytelling framework, you might think of it as a crutch, but really what it's doing is it's just helping you get to, some of the key things that you need to do more easily. The storytelling framework that I've grown to adopt is one that was actually shared to me by a business coach that I was working with at the time. And it's just CCAR, which stands for Context, Challenge, Action, Result. And I have seen it put in different terms, but essentially meaning the same thing. And so context is, what do my audience need to know about the situation that I'm bringing them into to understand like the whys and the wheres and all that sort of thing. The challenge is like, what happened? Did something change? Was there an obstacle? What was the difficulty that needed to be overcome? Which was a word you just used a moment ago, right? As far as, part of the reason we share stories and share these talks is because there is some challenge that we all share that we need to overcome, whether that's understanding something or solving a problem, or dealing with some weird thing about how a feature works. All of those things are potentially challenges to be overcome. And so then A stands for action, where how are we going to address that challenge? What are we going to do to try and fix it? What steps do we take? And then the result is kind of reporting back, like, how are things now? Like, what's changed? And the cool thing about it is like this can be like cyclical. So if you have that sort of 3-part structure that you talked about, like each one of those could be a CCAR, context, challenge, action, result. Or you could use just this one thing as, to fit into those 3, like you could have your context and your challenge, and then your action could be like the middle section, and then your result could be the 3rd section. So it fits well in both of those circumstances. And just to kind of give an example, I thought, we could make this very personal about our actual experience here, where the context that we were looking at in building this little series on how to go and, succeed at doing talks. The Salesforce community has a lot of opportunities for people to share what they've learned at community groups and conferences. So that's our context that we were in. The challenge is it can be hard for new speakers to get started and to feel empowered and to do things like provide good titles and abstracts to submissions, to build their talks. Like, all those things are the challenge. And on the other side, not so much conferences. Conferences probably usually get more talks than they need. But sometimes conferences can struggle to get enough talks. But certainly user groups, developer groups, admin groups are frequently looking for speakers and desperate to get new speakers in to talk. So there's a challenge on both sides. And so the action was that Jack and Peter decided to put together some guidelines and video series to help people become speakers. And the result, every group had enough speakers forever and ever, right? Or, like, yet to be seen. But like, if you wanted to break this down into a sort of CCAR, like, that's the story that you could tell about what you and I were doing as sort of a meta story. And if you think about any particular problem that you've had to deal with that could become a conference talk, it fits really well into this CCAR structure.
Yeah, I absolutely really, really like that. And it's got me. So I've never used the storytelling framework myself to do one of my talks, but even just that, like, every day is a learning day for me. I think that's one of the things that when you present or even doing something like this, I'm going, from listening to you, Peter, I'm going, I can use that, and I can apply that to what I'm preparing for in the coming months, where I have presentations, and that's what we're talking about, benefits of public speaking, but actually doing it, and we'll get to this in after the talk, but being able to doing it and reflecting on what you're doing even in the moment can be really powerful and really valuable about how you approach the next thing.
Yeah.
And your preparation.
Sometimes like the talk just sort of flows from your brain, and it's like, this was meant to be. But a lot of these tricks that we talked about, like the presentation patterns book, for example, or storytelling frameworks, these are things that you can use when it's not just flowing from your mind freely, but you're really working at getting the story down into your slides or into your paper, or building a demo or something like that. That's where going back to, having some tools in your toolkit to get yourself past that blocker, like that can be super, super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of slides and demos, one of the best bits of advice that I can give to beginner speakers is about thinking visually with your slides. Your slides that you prepare for a presentation are visual aids that support your message and not the message itself. I cannot even begin to explain how many talks I've been to where the presenter has read a wall of text from a slide.
Yeah.
And how unengaging it is.
It makes me want to walk out of the room when that happens, quite frankly.
Yeah, it does, and
that's happened for some people who I have a great amount of respect for. Like I like it has nothing to do with how much I like the person. It's just like, if you wanted me to read something, you should have just sent me a document, is kind of where I come from.
Right. Exactly. Nobody should be reading a wall of text instead of listening to what you say. Because if you have a wall of text up and you are saying things in a slightly more, if you're trying to tell a story about a wall of text and the wall of text is the context and you're telling the story, you want people to listen to the story. People can't listen and read. They just can't do that. They should be listening to you and what you're saying rather than reading that wall of text and are trying to absorb two different things at once. It's too much of an ask of your audience to do that. Last year, I started delivering all my presentations with no text on any slide. I used, for a number of talks last year, all I had on my slides were images. And the engagement that I got from the audience was significantly elevated because it was a visual prompt. And much of the time, it's a visual prompt for you. Where if you've crafted your narrative, you've crafted your story, you should have that story in there ready to talk. Those visual aids are a supporting message, not just for the audience, but I use them as visual prompts for me to remind myself of where I'm going and where my story is going.
Yeah,
and that's
100% agree.
Slides.
100% agree. Like that's, I would say I will have as punctuation a slide here or there that maybe brings up like some salient points that I want to summarize, or maybe has some information that's worth putting on there. And the one thing that I would say where having some text on the slide can be useful is if you want the slide to be like looked at by somebody after the fact and offline as information. And I think that's where you kind of have to balance. But certainly, I think, if you're going to give something like a keynote, like those types of presentations, you can almost do away with text altogether. The way to think about it is when you watch a really good documentary movie, the narrator, isn't putting every word up on the screen, right? That's not what you look at. You look at a picture or, some bit of, maybe a diagram or something like that that supports what the narrator is saying. And that's really the relationship, is that you're narrating a story when you're speaking. You don't want to present your audience with the conflict of, should I listen to what that person is saying or should I read what's on the slide? Because the minute you put too many words on a slide, you are distracting your audience from listening to you. And the most interesting thing about a presentation is you.
Yeah.
That's
100%.
That's why you're giving the talk.
Yeah, I totally agree. And coming back to build on the most important thing is you. When you're preparing and building your presentation, don't shy away from your personality and who you are. You like to use memes, use a meme. You are a natural comedian, use some jokes. You anything and all that we are, all of our personal experiences make up what it is that we do. You do not have to follow the style of somebody else because you think that's the way it should be done. Embrace your own style as your crafting and building that talk, and really stay centered, I guess, on who you are and how you like to do things.
And
Ultimately, that will have the best results.
I would go even further and say avoid trying to imitate anybody else. It's not gonna feel genuine to your audience. People will see through it, even if they don't. Even if your audience doesn't put their finger on it exactly what happened, like it's just gonna feel off. If you're trying to tell someone else's story, it's not gonna resonate. Okay, maybe it will, but there's a really, really high chance that what you can do is put your audience off, and you're not going to have accomplished what you tried to do. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned demos earlier as well, Peter. So many conferences have either live demos or recorded demos in them. I've live demoed twice in presentations, and it's something that I'm not very comfortable doing, so I try and shy away from doing it. But for folks that are looking to maybe demo something that they've built or how something works, what tips do you have for those people?
Yeah. So, the thing that you're going to want to do with a live demo is practice it a lot, because the last thing you want is to kind of like lose your way in the middle. And this is particularly important if you have a short talk, because time is tight, and if something doesn't go right, then like you can just lose the point altogether. So if a lot hangs on your demo, then make sure you've practiced a lot. Make sure it's really clear. Have some people watch it and give you feedback. Have a backup. Make sure you've recorded it, and if something fails and you really need people to see what that is, then quickly have the recording all queued up that you can just like quickly press a button, that it's loaded locally on your machine. It's not coming over the internet, and you can simply just play it and show them what you did. Sometimes, especially with developer features, people can get really caught up in, oh, you actually did the thing. You wrote some code and you did the thing. And that can feel very gratifying. On the other hand, I would always challenge people to ask, is it really adding to your presentation to do the 100% live thing? And sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't, or sometimes you might just want to do it, which is fine too if you have the confidence to. But if you don't, there's nothing wrong with a recording. In fact, if anybody's watched Todd Halfpenny do his presentations, he has a really clever thing where he has a recording of himself kind of being the demo driver. It's so basically like he's having a conversation with himself on a video, and you'd have to watch it to understand it. But it's a really clever way to not just have a recorded demo, but something that's really, really fun.
Yeah.
In the end, demos are what kind of show the story behind whatever the narrative is when it's a technical feature. And I guess the last thing I would say is reduce noise where possible. And what I mean by that is, screens can be very, very busy. So, you want to do what you can to plan that your demo is going to not have as few distractions as possible. So what could be an example of that? Well, let's say you were doing something with showing how a formula field worked, or for a developer, maybe showing what happened when a particular Apex trigger fired, let's say, and if you had to show that in the results of that in the user interface in the Salesforce org, one way to reduce noise could be basically to remove a lot of the extra fields on whatever user interface that you're doing it on. And that way, there isn't a whole lot of other things for people to look at. You just have maybe a couple of fields that are relevant to the actual demo that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that, for developers and code-based demos, don't just bring up the code as you would check it in to commit it for actually using the code in production. Reformat the code so that it is more readable. Take the time to tailor the code so that it highlights the bits that you want your audience to see. And that can be, if you have like maybe a method call, sort of making some space around it with some extra lines here or there, and, finding ways to call it out. So, live demos have extra challenges, and it just means you need to plan ahead to make sure that it's going to be successful as possible.
Yeah, I think live demos, when you get comfortable doing them, it allows for audience participation as well,
absolutely.
Which is another really strong part of being able to engage your audience and keep them bought into the story. If you bring them if you're able to bring them into the demo, then that could be really powerful. Taking naming suggestions for the field or the formula or the flow or whatever it is that you're demoing, that could be a really good way to get people bought into what it is that you're presenting.
And for an experienced, confident developer, like showing that you've actually done something live in person, it sort of raises your credibility with your audience. Like that's the one really valuable thing that you can get from it if you have the skill and the confidence to do it.
For sure. And ultimately, this all comes down to practice. Mm-hmm. Any preparation for conferences is not just that you've thought about the script or the talk track that you have in your head. Maybe for some people that will look like writing down the full script. I don't do that personally anymore. That's how I started, but I don't do that anymore. I give myself bullet points, which I have a good story around, and frameworks. But what I also do is, when I'm preparing for the presentations and rehearsing, I go multiple times out on a walk, or very rarely do I record myself. But out on a walk, I will think about that section of the presentation and multiple times run over it. How would I say this now? How would I say this now? What's the story? What's the story that I tell? Just to embed myself with those visual prompts that I've got from my slide, so I know what I need to talk about. I've rehearsed it a few times to myself in how I would deliver that, or the key points that I want to get across, and expand on that.
Yeah.
But rehearsing out loud, whether it's to the mirror, or recording yourself on a Zoom meeting, or to colleagues, or like you've said, Peter, somebody that you trust to give you honest and constructive feedback, is going to be really helpful, especially for your first one.
Yeah. And I quite like
use as many dry runs as possible.
Yeah, totally. I quite like the personal recording, at least a few times, for timing. I often find that I have way more stuff to say than I actually have time to.
1,000,000%.
That, doing the talk, practicing, seeing how long I take. And then, sometimes it means I need to make some hard choices on what I include or what I don't. Sometimes it also just means I need to get on with the message, because I can definitely, I've got the gift of the gab, and I can kind of waffle on. And so, then it forces me to be honest with myself. Like, am I sticking to the point? Am I sticking to the story, or am I kind of like wandering outside the lines a little bit? And, that helps me get back to focusing on, what's the message I'm trying to say here?
Absolutely. And to add to that, if you have a 5-minute lightning talk, 5 minutes is not a long time. Even 25 minutes, a standard conference session, is typically around 20 minutes. It is not a long time. You'll be surprised how fast that goes. So really being able to time yourself and refine your talk track and how you deliver what your message is. You may well write these things down, or how you would present it, and you can read something far faster than you can talk it.
Yeah.
Especially when you take into account any natural pauses, thinking time, etc. And that 20 minutes will be chewed up faster than you can even believe until you experience it for the first time.
Yeah.
So getting that timing and really being able to, like you've said, Peter, is focus on that brevity and the clarity of your message is really important.
And I think, one thing that I've thought of that actually we didn't put in the guide at all, but it occurred to me as we were talking is scripts, right? Now, I don't use a script when I talk. Do you?
Me either.
Yeah.
No.
But there are people who do, and that is perfectly valid, especially if you're a beginner. I've tried using scripts recently. There was actually yeah, so I did a demo jam for the first time, and I did this for a client, and I wanted to go back and re-record the demo jam so that they could have it on their own YouTube channel. And so I did that, and I used my script. And for a demo jam, I think you absolutely have to script it, because you literally have whatever that is, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and if you go over, boom, like you didn't actually get your message across, right? It's much better to finish earlier, than to be in the middle of a sentence and have the the flag go on the field and you have to like walk off, right? So if a script will help you be confident in front of an audience, totally use a script. It's going to be a lot more work to memorize it. For me, when I use a script, I sound like I read a script, and I don't like how that sounds when I watch it back. So, I've made a conscious choice that I give myself a framework and an outline, and I know the points that I want to say on a given slide, and I have kind of an understanding of how each slide is leading in and like what the next slide is that I'm kind of leading up to, right? And then I just let myself talk. There's a lot of people who just can't do that, and that's totally fine. You can be successful if you write a script and you just stick to your script. A lot of people do that. Practice it a lot. And then what I would say is practice getting it into your own voice. Because in the end, people, this whole thing is about connection, right? Getting somebody to remember your talk is about connecting with them. That's harder to do, I think, with a script, but not impossible. You just need to practice more and get to a point where saying the script is just, as natural as kind of speaking in person.
Absolutely. And one of those things, if you do take the scripted approach, which I began doing, one of the best things, if you're thinking about your presentation and the amount of time that you have on the topic, is whether you bake in a Q&A portion of the presentation. And I often found in my early speaking days, the Q&A portion of my session was the best part of my session. It was more free flowing, and that audience engagement was really positive, and that Q&A format allowed me to think more fluidly about the thing that I had just been talking about and presented about. So Q&A is a really good way to, number one, check if your message has sunk in, or to elaborate on points that you may have missed or may have slipped out in the delivery stage. It dropped off, and allows for some of that curiosity. So if you have time for a Q&A portion, the best advice I have is to embrace it for 5-10 minutes, whatever it is that you can spare.
So maybe we should wrap up with kind of, there's a few other points that I wanted to just get out there, and then sound good?
That sounds great.
A little bit of a lightning round.
Yeah, lightning round.
So keep your audience front of mind always. Always come back to audience. If you get stuck, come back to your audience. And I often try and think of my talks as a love letter to my audience. Like what is going to be the thing that they will absolutely adore about this thing. We kind of talked about this, but the shorter the talk, the more you'll need to practice. At least that's been my experience. For longer talks, not a bad idea to have some sort of optional stuff. If you find like you manage to get through like really quickly and you have time for sort of an extra demo, have it prepared, have it in your back pocket, or some extra material that might be sort of supplemental, but not necessarily critical to getting your point across. Make sure to time your presentation from the talk. So, you can sort of run long if you haven't accounted for things like pace, like your pace and pauses and that sort of thing. We did talk about practicing in front of an audience, and we did leave some questions in the guide that you can specifically and pointedly ask your audience and get them over feeling uncomfortable, maybe saying things that could feel uncomfortable to say. So get them to ask questions, or sorry, get them to give you feedback both on the content and the style, but also on things like pacing, understandability, your voice, vocalization, eye contact. Get them to critique you on everything about your talk. And then finally, don't forget to promote your talk in advance. You are the product for this conference or for this developer group. You have become part of why people are coming to this conference. So you're helping the conference people out, the conference organizers out, by promoting their conference and your session.
Absolutely. Solid sound advice in the lightning rounds. And that is your guide to preparing your presentation.